December 25, 1776. Most of the Continental Army's enlistments are set to expire in just 6 days. If Washington doesn't achieve a victory now, his army and the revolution will effectively dissolve on New Year's Day. The force has been battered by months of consecutive defeats. What remains is a group of just 2,400 exhausted, starving soldiers clinging to the edge of the colonies. They have gone days without a proper meal, and their uniforms have deteriorated into rags. Many lack basic military supplies, forcing them to wrap torn cloth around their bare feet just to keep moving through the freezing mud. By any conventional metric of warfare, this army is functionally destroyed. Launching an offensive attack in this condition defies military logic to both the men in the ranks and the enemy tracking them. Across the river in Trenton sit nearly 1,400 Hessian troops. They are professional mercenaries employed by the British Empire, well-fed and comfortably waiting out the winter in secure barracks. These elite soldiers carry standardized, high-quality muskets and fresh ammunition, giving them a massive firepower advantage over the struggling rebellion. Between these two forces lies a lethal physical barrier. The Delaware River is choked with massive chunks of floating ice, and a fierce winter storm is actively moving in. The conditions are so severe that many of George Washington's own officers advise him to halt. They view a crossing in total darkness as a guaranteed suicide mission. To survive, Washington must defeat a professional army and endure an environment that is actively trying to freeze his men to death. This requires a level of success that looks on the surface like a miracle. Washington ignores his officers' doubts and orders his men into the boats anyway. On Christmas night, they march directly into the freezing gale. The crossing takes hours. The Continental soldiers fight powerful, chaotic currents in total darkness, pushing heavy blocks of ice away from their fragile wooden hulls. The freezing winds and powerful currents pose a lethal threat before a single shot is fired. One wrong maneuver in the dark and a boat capsizes, plunging heavily equipped men into water where survival is mathematically impossible. Reaching the New Jersey shoreline without mass casualties proves that the physical environment is an adversary every bit as dangerous as the soldiers waiting in Trenton. Washington actively chose to launch his attack into the teeth of a lethal winter storm. The extreme weather was the central pillar of his entire strategy. He timed the strike for Christmas night, anticipating that the Hessian garrison would be resting and celebrating, leaving their defensive patrols neglected. Moving through impassable weather, Washington blinds the enemy. The storm hides his advancing columns. At dawn, the Americans are already inside Trenton. The Hessians are caught off guard, scrambling in the snow. In 90 minutes, the garrison is overwhelmed, capturing hundreds with no fatalities. This wasn't a drawn-out slugfest. The victory was a swift execution made possible by using environmental manipulation to strip the enemy of their ability to react. This is a textbook execution of asymmetric strategy. When a smaller force faces a massive, well-equipped opponent, direct confrontation is a losing bet. They have to use unconventional tactics. This map of the Battle of Brandywine shows standard 18th century military doctrine. Armies fought in clear weather, forming neat, highly structured lines across open fields. Traditional empires depend on these predictable engagements to leverage their superior numbers and artillery. Washington threw those rules out. If you are outgunned and outmanned, the only logical path to victory is refusing to play the game by the enemy's established rules. The news of the victory at Trenton spreads quickly. Enlistments surge, colonial morale rebounds, and the colonies realize the Continental Army is capable of winning. The victory at Trenton was the result of strategic calculation rather than chance or divine intervention. Washington looked at his two greatest liabilities, a dying army and a lethal winter storm, and combined them into a lethal advantage. He turned the very thing that was supposed to kill his men into the weapon that saved them. The victory that saved the American Revolution was a masterclass in strategic risk, proving superior intellect and timing can outmaneuver the greatest empire on Earth. In the summer of 1775, the American colonies rebelled against the most powerful empire on Earth. The men volunteering to fight for independence were mostly farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants. Many had never fired a musket. Across the Atlantic, Great Britain possessed a professional military machine designed for total dominance. Military commanders of the 18th century believed wars were won one way, standing face-to-face in open fields, trading volleys of lead, and capturing territory until someone surrendered. Look at the sheer scale of the mismatch. Britain had a booming economy, a massive royal navy, and thousands of trained Hessian mercenaries. The Continental Army had no standing government, a severe shortage of gunpowder, and soldiers often wearing civilian clothes into combat. Every time the Continental Army stepped onto a battlefield to fight a traditional European engagement, they risked total annihilation. Britain could afford to lose a battle and ship over reinforcements. America could not. On this map, you see where conventional tactics nearly ended the rebellion. Outmaneuvered, Washington's forces were trapped on Brooklyn Heights against the East River. Under the cover of a thick fog, he silently evacuated his entire army across the water to Manhattan. The escape from Long Island forced Washington into a harsh realization. As long as his army remained intact, the rebellion remained alive. If the army was destroyed, the revolution was over. His greatest responsibility was no longer capturing cities or winning newspaper headlines. His single objective was keeping his men alive to fight another day, even if it meant retreating from every major city on the coast. This approach mirrored the ancient Roman commander Quintus Fabius Maximus. Instead of seeking glorious, decisive clashes, Washington decided to engage only when the odds heavily favored him, and withdraw without hesitation when they didn't. This timeline illustrates the reality of an ocean-spanning conflict. Every shipment crossing the Atlantic consumed enormous resources. By avoiding large battles and dragging the conflict out, Washington turned time itself into a weapon, steadily exhausting the treasury and the patience of the British Parliament. By December 1776, however, the strategy faced a severe test. After months of retreats, thousands of American soldiers had gone home. Enlistments were expiring. Without a visible victory, the Continental Army was about to dissolve completely. Washington bypassed the main British force and looked for an isolated vulnerability. He found it in Trenton, New Jersey, where a garrison of Hessian soldiers was stationed. On Christmas night, he marched his exhausted men through sleet and snow, crossed an ice-choked river in the dark, and overwhelmed the camp before dawn. A week later, a large British force cornered him at Assunpink Creek. Washington ordered campfires to remain burning and had men make noise with shovels to simulate digging in. Under the cover of this illusion, the main army quietly slipped away and marched through the freezing night and captured another victory at Princeton. Washington was no longer reacting to British movements. Through calculated strikes and sudden disappearances, he forced the British to guess where he would appear next, slowing their advance and putting them permanently on the defensive. To stay one step ahead, he needed accurate intelligence. Look closely at this cipher desk. It was one of many tools used by the Culper spy ring, a covert network of ordinary citizens operating right under the noses of British officers in New York. Using invisible ink, dead drops, and complex numerical codes, these agents fed Washington the exact locations of enemy troops. He used this information to spread false rumors and deliberately move his own supplies at night. British commanders were constantly paralyzed, unsure if the intelligence they gathered was real or a carefully constructed trap. But information could not protect soldiers from the elements. In the winter of 1777, the army retreated to the freezing wilderness of Valley Forge. Men slept in crude log huts, often without shoes or proper coats. Nearly 2,000 soldiers died from typhus, dysentery, and starvation. Washington chose to live among them, sharing their deprivation to keep the army from fracturing. Meanwhile, a Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben began drilling the survivors, teaching them the standardized tactics of a professional military force. The British assumed the harsh winter would break the rebellion. Instead, the raw recruits who marched into the snow emerged in the spring as a disciplined, unified force capable of executing Washington's strategy. By 1781, 6 years of continuous warfare had taken its toll. By 1781, 6 years of continuous warfare had taken its toll. Millions of pounds were spent, and support in London was crumbling. Washington's strategy of exhaustion was working, but he needed a final opportunity to break the stalemate. That opportunity arrived when British General Charles Cornwallis positioned his army on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia, relying entirely on the Royal Navy to supply or evacuate his men. Washington initiated a massive deception. He built sprawling, fake military camps outside New York City and allowed false intelligence to reach British commanders, convincing them an attack on Manhattan was imminent. While the British braced for an assault in the north, Washington began to march thousands of troops south. At the exact same time, an Allied French fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, blocking any chance of a British escape by sea. Completely cut off and relentlessly bombarded, Cornwallis surrendered. Yorktown cost Britain an entire army and the political will to afford a conflict that no longer had a visible end. Washington secured independence by rewriting the rules of the war, prioritizing the survival of his army over the defense of territory. This demonstrates a kind of leadership that rarely makes it into heroic myths. It isn't measured by a reckless charge into battle, but by the discipline to endure painful setbacks, adapt to overwhelming odds, and maintain focus on the ultimate objective. True resilience is the determination to keep moving with purpose through the dark, waiting for the precise moment where endurance yields a victory. This document was signed in July of 1776. By August, the ink was barely dry, and the revolution was already facing its first and potentially last existential crisis. The men tasked with defending this new country were hardly a professional military force. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and day laborers. Many of them had never fired a weapon in combat, and they marched in a chaotic mix of civilian clothes and bare feet. Take a look at these antique flintlock muskets. This represents the grim logistical crisis paralyzing George Washington's army. Gunpowder and ammunition were heavily rationed. Uniforms were practically non-existent. Enlistments lasted only a few months. The army could simply walk home. This split-screen visualization shows the raw math of the conflict. The British Empire had massive financial wealth, the world's most powerful naval fleet, and elite professional troops. The colonies had no heavy industry, no standing army, and zero centralized funding. When you compare these resources side by side, it's clear that the Continental Army stood little chance of survival in a direct, head-on confrontation with the British. This map shows Manhattan, where Washington attempted a conventional defense of the valuable Deepwater Harbor. The plan failed. 30,000 British and Hessian soldiers outmaneuvered his troops. By late August, thousands of Americans were pinned here, with the uncrossable East River cutting off their retreat. The stakes were absolute. If the British launched one final assault at sunrise, the Continental Army would be wiped out. The revolution would end in its very first year. On the night of August 29th, a heavy, thick fog suddenly rolled in across the East River, completely blanketing the American lines. Under that cover of weather, Washington organized a seemingly impossible evacuation. He intended to ferry his entire trapped army across the water, directly under the noses of the sleeping British sentries. The mechanics of this operation were staggering. Boat after boat quietly arrived at the shore. Thousands of men, heavy cannons, panicked horses, and precious supplies had to be loaded into wooden rowboats in pitch darkness. The margin for error was zero. A dropped musket, the splash of a clumsy oar, or a single horse crying out in the dark would have alerted the sentries and triggered an immediate massacre. In that moment, the survival of the United States relied entirely on a ragtag, exhausted militia maintaining absolute discipline in the dark. Dawn broke. The heavy fog finally lifted off the banks of Brooklyn Heights, and the impossible had actually happened. Virtually the entire Continental Army had successfully crossed the river to Manhattan without detection. British commanders ordered their troops forward, expecting to finish the rebellion with a final slaughter. Instead, they walked into completely abandoned dirt trenches. Washington had orchestrated an astonishing military withdrawal, saving his trapped men from certain doom. Looking at this portrait of George Washington, we see a man who just saw his cause nearly vanish. The escape from Long Island was a harsh lesson, one that would guide every major decision he made for the rest of the war. The experience at Brooklyn Heights proved that holding a coastline against a naval power like Britain was a recipe for destruction. He stopped searching for the glorious, decisive battlefield victories that defined the traditional European mindset. He adopted a constant cycle of evasion, minor skirmishes, and tactical retreats. Beating Britain did not require winning every battle. By extending the timeline, Washington weaponized time itself. Refusing to disappear drained British resources and exhausted their political will. That heavy fog in New York Harbor gave the colonies their ultimate strategic advantage. It produced a commander who understood that relentless, stubborn survival was the only way to win. In the 18th century, military commanders agreed on exactly how a war should be fought. You marched your army into an open field, engaged the enemy in direct combat, captured their territory, and forced them to surrender. Great Britain had perfected this system. They controlled a global empire, backed by massive financial wealth, the world's most powerful navy, and a highly disciplined army of 30,000 professional soldiers. George Washington inherited the exact opposite. His Continental Army was a loose collection of farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants. They had limited training, no naval support, and gunpowder was so scarce it had to be strictly rationed. Many of his men didn't even have proper uniforms. By every traditional metric, the British advantages in manpower and money made a conventional American victory impossible. A direct confrontation on a traditional European-style battlefield would lead straight to the collapse of the American cause. In the summer of 1776, Britain decided to crush the rebellion before it could spread. They launched a massive military expedition across the Atlantic, aiming straight for the deep-water port of New York City. Believing he had to hold the strategic city to keep the revolution alive, Washington stood his ground and deployed his defenses. He played by the conventional rulebook, and he was completely outmaneuvered. Experienced British troops easily flanked the American lines, driving them back in chaos. Within hours, thousands of American soldiers found themselves backed into a corner on Brooklyn Heights. The British Army was closing in from the front, and the deep waters of the East River blocked any escape from behind. The standard rules of combat had led the Continental Army into a geographic trap. If the British launched one final assault the next morning, the American Revolution would end in its very first year. But that final attack never came. Instead, under the cover of a dense, heavy fog, Washington organized a massive evacuation. In complete silence, boat after boat ferried soldiers, horses, and cannons across the dark river. By the time the sun rose and the fog finally lifted, British sentries were staring at empty trenches. The entire American army had vanished. Washington saw that dodging the enemy kept his force intact. Survival in the field became more important than the pride of a direct engagement. He realized he could not afford to fight pitched battles against a superior empire. While critics viewed the retreat from New York as a failure, the decision signaled a focus on strategic survival over territorial defense. Washington was deliberately throwing out the European rulebook. His main objective shifted entirely. He stopped trying to capture territory or chase decisive battlefield victories. His sole goal was keeping the Continental Army alive. This approach mirrored the ancient Roman commander Quintus Fabius Maximus. Facing stronger enemies, Fabius avoided direct combat, relying instead on patience, calculated withdrawals, and constant low-level pressure. Historians call this the Fabian strategy. Washington applied this to Britain's vulnerability, distance. Supplying troops across the Atlantic was a massive, continuous drain on their treasury. Every month the war dragged on, the immense cost tested British taxpayers. But as long as Washington's army survived, the revolution existed. Washington realized he didn't need to defeat the British military. He just needed to trap them in a long, grueling war of attrition until the empire effectively bankrupted its own political will to fight. By December 1776, that strategy was put to the ultimate test. The Continental Army was freezing, starving, and shrinking rapidly as short-term enlistments expired. Morale had hit rock bottom. Washington urgently needed a victory to keep his remaining soldiers from returning home. But launching a large-scale attack against the main British forces would violate his strict rule of survival and risk destroying the army. He needed a highly specific target. He found it in Trenton, New Jersey, where an isolated garrison of 1,400 Hessian mercenaries was stationed. The British had spread their outposts thin, entirely confident that the exhausted Americans were too weak to launch an offensive. That overconfidence was a glaring vulnerability, offering exactly the kind of low-risk, high-reward strike Washington's strategy required. Executing the plan carried immense physical risk. On Christmas night, under the cover of complete darkness, the army had to navigate an ice-choked river, then march 9 miles through a freezing winter storm to ensure total surprise. The attack was swift and decisive. They hit the garrison from 2 directions at dawn. Within 90 minutes, organized resistance collapsed. 900 Hessian soldiers were captured, while American casualties remained incredibly light. The true value of Trenton was psychological. Men who had been packing their bags chose to re-enlist. Despairing communities found fresh hope, and foreign powers began taking the American cause seriously. Washington kept the revolution alive by refusing to fight the war his enemy wanted. He secured independence by rewriting the rules of engagement until the British Empire simply exhausted itself. When George Washington accepted command of the Continental Army in the summer of 1775, he inherited a rebellion hanging by a thread. The men under his command were farmers, blacksmiths, and laborers. Many had never fired a weapon in combat. They lacked consistent discipline, adequate gunpowder, and even standard uniforms, with many soldiers marching into battle wearing their everyday civilian clothes. Across the battlefield stood the exact opposite. Great Britain commanded the most powerful empire on earth, backed by a dominant Royal Navy and thousands of highly disciplined German mercenaries known as Hessians. Military commanders of the 18th century operated by a rigid set of rules. Wars were won by finding the enemy, defeating them in glorious open combat, and capturing their cities to force a surrender. On paper, the mathematics of the conflict were clear. If Washington tried to fight this traditional, territorial war against a vastly superior professional force, he was guaranteed to lose. That traditional approach was put to the ultimate test in the summer of 1776, when a massive British expeditionary force converged on New York Harbor to crush the rebellion in one decisive blow. This period map of the Battle of Long Island illustrates the resulting disaster. British commanders easily outmaneuvered Washington's defenses, pushing the American forces back until thousands of troops were trapped on Brooklyn Heights, pinned directly against the East River. Facing total annihilation by morning, Washington organized a silent withdrawal. Under the cover of a dense, rolling fog that settled over the water, boat after boat ferried the Continental Army across the river to Manhattan in near complete darkness. By sunrise, the army had vanished. Losing New York was a devastating blow, but the escape forced Washington to rethink his entire approach. If he prioritized defending cities over keeping his soldiers alive, the revolution would end. He adopted an approach historians would later call the Fabian strategy, named after an ancient Roman commander. Instead of seeking decisive battlefield victories, Washington would rely on relentless patience and calculated withdrawals. Britain could afford a few battlefield setbacks. The colonies could not. But as long as the Continental Army remained intact in the field, the British Empire would have to keep paying for an expensive, unpopular war across the Atlantic. By December 1776, however, constant retreating had taken its toll. Enlistments were expiring, morale had cratered, and Washington desperately needed a strategic victory to keep the army from dissolving entirely. He chose an incredibly dangerous, highly specific target: an isolated garrison of Hessian soldiers stationed in the town of Trenton. On Christmas night, his troops marched through freezing rain and crossed the ice-choked waters of the Delaware River. Looking at this tactical map of the operation, you can see how Washington struck a weak link instead of the main British force. American columns converged on the town from 2 directions at dawn, completely surprising the garrison and forcing a rapid collapse of Hessian resistance. When General Cornwallis marched south to trap the Americans near Assunpink Creek days later, Washington used deception to slip away again. Leaving campfires burning to trick British sentries, his army quietly bypassed the main force, securing another victory at Princeton. In less than 2 weeks, Washington proved he was no longer fighting on British terms. By relying on unexpected movements and surprise attacks, he kept the enemy constantly guessing and took control over the psychological pace of the conflict. To make this strategy sustainable, Washington needed a military force capable of executing it. That required surviving the brutal winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, an unforgiving wilderness camp where disease, freezing temperatures, and starvation killed nearly 2,000 soldiers. Those who survived underwent a rigorous physical and mental transformation. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben introduced standardized drills, teaching a core group of soldiers professional battlefield tactics that rapidly spread through the entire camp. While the army trained physically, Washington built a different kind of weapon. He invested heavily in an intelligence network, most notably the Culper spy ring, turning ordinary citizens into agents operating deep inside British-controlled territory. These merchants, farmers, and tavern owners risked execution to gather information, relying on surprisingly sophisticated tradecraft. They communicated using invisible ink, hidden dead drops, complex numerical codes, and specific patterns of laundry hung on clotheslines to signal each other. Washington weaponized this intelligence to create deliberate confusion. He fed false troop movements to the British and spread rumors of fake attacks, forcing their commanders to freeze their decision-making and commit forces defensively to counter threats that didn't exist. Between a newly disciplined fighting force and a deliberate campaign of psychological misdirection, Washington neutralized the massive numerical advantage of the British Empire. The British command arrived in America expecting a conventional war of conquest. Instead, they found themselves trapped in an exhausting, invisible war of attrition they were never prepared to fight. Great Britain poured immense financial wealth and thousands of highly trained soldiers into the colonies, but Washington's methods made it impossible for them to ever fully leverage that strength. Washington secured his legacy as a deeply disciplined grand strategist, valuing the long-term survival of the cause over the immediate glory of the battlefield. By unlearning the established military rules of the 18th century, he laid the early groundwork for modern asymmetric warfare. His patience outlasted an empire, and in doing so, he secured the survival of the United States.
History has a habit of making unlikely victories seem inevitable. Looking back at the American Revolution, it's easy to picture a glorious, unstoppable march to independence. But in the winter of 1776, the Continental Army was exhausted, starving, and on the edge of total collapse. They were facing the most powerful empire in the world. Great Britain possessed overwhelming financial resources, undisputed control of the seas through the Royal Navy, and a massive, highly disciplined professional army. At the time, military commanders across Europe played by a very specific set of rules. Wars were won through decisive, open-field combat. You found the enemy, marched your massive forces forward, crushed their lines, and forced a surrender. The American colonies had no standing army, limited industry, and barely any gunpowder. Meeting Great Britain head-on in a conventional battle was a mathematical impossibility. Following the traditional rules of war was a guaranteed death sentence for the rebellion. Washington learned this the hard way during the summer of 1776. At the Battle of Long Island, his attempt to defend New York City on conventional terms ended in a massive tactical disaster, leaving his battered army trapped with the East River at their backs. Annihilation was hours away. But under the cover of heavy fog, Washington organized a completely silent, desperate nighttime withdrawal. He loaded thousands of soldiers, horses, and cannons into small boats, ferrying them across the river to Manhattan before the British even realized they were gone. Long Island proved that holding a specific city was irrelevant if the cost was the destruction of the Continental Army. From that point on, Washington stopped thinking like a traditional battlefield commander and started thinking like a strategist determined to win a long war. His only true responsibility was keeping his men in the field. As long as the army remained intact, the American Revolution remained alive. This new approach mirrored the ancient Roman Fabian strategy, a doctrine centered on constant evasion. Washington avoided large engagements, retreating to prioritize the preservation of his forces. To critics, this looked like cowardice. In reality, moving thousands of men and artillery through hostile territory required extraordinary discipline. By refusing to stand and fight, Washington actively weaponized time.
Every mile the British Army marched cost Parliament money. Every month they spent chasing ghosts across the American wilderness drained their political patience back in London. He wasn't trying to defeat the Royal Army on the battlefield. He was systematically exhausting their political will to continue the war. But evasion alone couldn't sustain a revolution forever. By December 1776, constant retreats had severely damaged American morale, and thousands of troop enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year. The army was about to legally dissolve. Washington searched for an opportunity to strike without risking the entire army. He found it at an isolated Hessian outpost in Trenton. Because it was physically separated from the main British force by miles of harsh winter terrain, it offered a rare strategic opening. Executing the strike was extraordinarily dangerous. On Christmas night, his men crossed the ice-choked Delaware River in complete darkness, marching 9 miles through freezing temperatures to reach the target. The surprise attack was a stunning success. They captured over 900 Hessian soldiers, with remarkably light American casualties. The news electrified the colonies, prompting desperate soldiers to re-enlist and communities to believe the cause had a pulse. Trenton proved that boldness was only valuable when it served a larger strategy. Washington was no longer gambling. He was choosing the one battle that offered the greatest reward for the smallest strategic risk. Keeping the army alive also meant surviving the elements. During the brutal winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, disease and starvation killed nearly 2,000 soldiers. Yet Washington chose to live in the camp and suffer alongside his men, earning a trust that no formal order could command. While they endured the freezing wilderness, a Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben introduced standardized drills and tactics. He transformed a ragged, starving militia into a professional fighting force, capable of standing toe-to-toe with Britain's elite regulars. As the army improved physically, Washington expanded his intelligence network. He built the Culper spy ring, where ordinary citizens gathered vital information from British-occupied cities using invisible ink and complex numerical codes. Washington used this stream of intelligence to leak false rumors and stage fake troop movements. By forcing British commanders to second-guess their own information, he paralyzed their decision-making and forced them to commit troops defensively. By professionalizing his ranks in the snow and making the British fight ghosts in the shadows, Washington leveled the playing field against a superior force. This patient strategy paid off in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army into a defensive position at Yorktown, Virginia, assuming the Royal Navy would maintain control of the sea. Washington saw his opening, but he needed to keep the British in New York from sending reinforcements. He built fake encampments to create the illusion of an assault on Manhattan. While British commanders watched the Hudson River, Washington quietly slipped south. American and French forces marched rapidly toward Virginia. At the same time, a French fleet defeated the Royal Navy and sealed off the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's only escape route. Allied artillery pounded the trapped British positions day and night. The relentless bombardment steadily choked the defenses until Cornwallis, with no hope of rescue, surrendered his entire army. Yorktown was the ultimate proof of Washington's endurance. He didn't destroy the British Empire. He simply forced it into a war it could no longer afford to win. The revolution survived because Washington looked past the immediate humiliation of retreat to focus on the years of perseverance required for a final victory. It's a perspective that translates directly to any long-term endeavor, whether it's navigating a career through a struggling economy or a business through a season of crisis. We often treat resilience as a test of brute force, a stubborn refusal to fail, or a willingness to charge recklessly into unwinnable odds just to prove our strength. True leadership is much quieter. It requires the wisdom to know when to pull back, the patience to wait for the right opening, and the discipline to constantly adapt to your own limitations. Life's greatest victories are rarely won in a single dramatic moment. They are secured through the quiet perseverance to simply outlast your hardest seasons, without losing sight of your purpose. In the 18th century, military victory followed a rigid, professional script.
To win a war, you found the enemy, defeated them in open combat, and then seized their territory. It was a game of theater and direct force that had dictated the borders of Europe for generations. But the Continental Army of 1776 wasn't built for that script. It was a collection of farmers, blacksmiths, and laborers. Most had no formal training, few supplies, and served under short-term enlistments that threatened to expire before the first winter arrived. They were facing the most powerful empire on the planet. Great Britain possessed a global economy, a professional standing army, and a royal navy that could move more troops across the Atlantic than the colonies had in their entire military. Despite these odds, Washington initially tried to fight a conventional war. He committed his army to defending New York City. The city's deep water harbor was strategically vital, but as this map shows, its geography made it a death trap for any force that didn't control the surrounding water. Trying to hold a fixed position against the British Navy was a fatal miscalculation. By adhering to the traditional rules of European warfare, Washington inadvertently placed the entire revolution in a position where one bad day of fighting could end the rebellion forever. The consequences arrived at the Battle of Long Island. British commanders outmaneuvered the American lines, driving the Continental Army back into Brooklyn Heights. With the East River behind them and 30,000 British and Hessian troops closing in from the front, the army was cornered. Had the British launched a final assault the next morning, the Continental Army would have been destroyed. The revolution was likely hours away from total collapse. On the night of August 29th, a heavy fog drifted across the river. Under this cover, Washington organized a silent withdrawal. Boat after boat ferried men, horses, and cannons to Manhattan. The operation required total silence. A single mistake would have alerted British sentries and turned the retreat into a massacre. By sunrise, the Americans had vanished. When the fog lifted, British troops found an empty camp, their enemy having escaped right through their fingers. This escape changed the way Washington viewed the conflict. He realized that while the British could replace lost soldiers and supplies, the colonies could not. From this point on, keeping the army alive became a higher priority than capturing a city or winning a headline. Washington pivoted to a doctrine known as the Fabian strategy. Named after the Roman commander who defeated stronger enemies through patience and evasion, the goal was to avoid decisive battles and instead wear the enemy down through a war of exhaustion. The logic was simple. An army that survives a defeat can fight again, but an army that is annihilated can never recover. As this diagram illustrates, time was Washington's most effective weapon. Every mile the British marched and every month the war continued increased the financial cost for Parliament. He just needed to outlast their willingness to pay for the war. However, by December 1776, the strategy of withdrawal looked like cowardice to his critics. The army was starving, freezing, and thousands were planning to return home when their enlistments expired at the end of the month. The Fabian strategy was theoretically sound, but Washington needed a victory to prove the army was still capable of fighting. To keep his men from disappearing, he had to find a target that offered a high reward with a low strategic risk. Washington began searching the British lines for a specific vulnerability, not a grand battlefield, but an isolated outpost where he could strike and vanish. He targeted the town of Trenton, where 1,400 Hessian soldiers were stationed. They were elite troops, but they were isolated and overconfident, believing the retreating Americans were too weak to launch an attack. The plan was a massive gamble. It required a night crossing of an ice-choked river, followed by a 9-mile march in a freezing storm to achieve total surprise. On Christmas night, the army crossed the Delaware. As snow and sleet lashed the boats, many officers wondered if the mission should be abandoned, but Washington pushed forward, knowing this was the only way to save the revolution. Speed and secrecy were the only things protecting them. If the Hessians had any warning, the exhausted American soldiers would likely be overwhelmed. The attack caught the garrison completely by surprise. Within 90 minutes, the Americans captured more than 900 prisoners while suffering remarkably light casualties. The prisoners taken at Trenton were less important than the men who stayed. Thousands of soldiers who were ready to quit chose to re-enlist, and a rebellion that had been on the verge of collapse
suddenly had a renewed belief in its own survival. The British responded by sending General Charles Cornwallis with 8,000 soldiers to trap Washington against the Assunpink Creek. By nightfall, the British were certain they had Washington cornered. Cornwallis famously declared he had the old fox safe and planned to finish him in the morning, but Washington used the darkness to deceive them. He ordered his men to keep their campfires burning and had a small detail make noise with shovels, giving the impression they were digging in for a fight. While the fires burned, the main army slipped away. They muffled their wagon wheels with cloth and marched silently around the British flank. At sunrise, Cornwallis found an empty camp. While he was staring at the riverbank, Washington was already miles away, launching a surprise attack on a secondary British force in Princeton. These maneuvers forced the British into a state of permanent uncertainty. By refusing to fight on the enemy's terms, Washington had moved from a defensive posture to one where he, not the British, dictated when and where the war would be fought. These consecutive victories shattered the myth of British invincibility. British commanders now had to account for an enemy that could appear anywhere, strike quickly, and vanish before a counterattack could be organized. This required Washington to abandon the era's obsession with honorable battlefield glory. He accepted the taunts of his critics, who called his retreats a sign of weakness in order to preserve the only thing that mattered, his army. Washington's genius was recognizing that the war wouldn't be won by matching Britain's strength. It would be won by changing the rules of the game until Britain's greatest strengths were rendered useless. In 1775, a group of farmers, blacksmiths, and laborers volunteered to defend an idea. They were an underdog force taking on the world's supreme military empire with limited training and almost no professional experience. The contrast in resources was stark. While British forces and Hessian mercenaries were elite and well-supplied, American troops fought with scarce gunpowder and often lacked basic shoes. Looking at this flintlock mechanism, you can see the type of basic manual weaponry that stood against the global reach of the British military. 18th century warfare followed a specific set of rules. For most generals, the goal was to seek out a single decisive battle, capture the enemy's territory, and force a total surrender. By these traditional rules, the American Revolution was a mathematical impossibility. If the colonists tried to win by capturing cities and holding ground, the rebellion would be crushed within months. This map shows New York in 1776. Washington attempted to follow European convention by making a stand here, hoping to defend the vital Deepwater Harbor. But it was a tactical disaster. British troops outmaneuvered the American lines, trapping thousands against the East River. Under the cover of a heavy nighttime fog, Washington organized a silent withdrawal. Boat after boat ferried the army across the water to safety, preventing a total massacre before the British could launch a final assault. Washington saw the reality of his situation. While Britain could afford to lose a battle, a single cataclysmic defeat would end the revolution forever. Conventional warfare was now a suicide mission. Washington shifted his entire objective. His responsibility was no longer capturing cities, but simply keeping the Continental Army alive and in the field. He adopted what historians call the Fabian strategy. This approach relies on patience and the refusal to engage in high-risk, decisive combat. This chart shows the logic. Victory was redefined from taking territory to ensuring survival. This pivot was based on economic reality. Every month the war continued, the accumulating cost of shipping troops and supplies across the Atlantic tested the patience of the British Parliament. By making survival the only metric of success, Washington weaponized time. He intended to exhaust the British treasury until the war became too expensive and unpopular to continue. By late 1776, the strategy faced its greatest test. Morale was at rock bottom, and with enlistments about to expire, the army was on the verge of dissolving. Washington applied his new logic at Trenton. He ignored the main British army and instead targeted an isolated, overconfident outpost of Hessian soldiers. Crossing the ice-filled Delaware River on Christmas night was an extreme hazard, but it was a strictly calculated risk. It served a specific goal, securing a victory that offered the highest psychological reward for the lowest strategic danger. Days later at Assunpink Creek, Washington used deception to escape again. He left campfires burning as an illusion to trick the British, while his army slipped away in the dark to strike an unsuspecting force at Princeton. These unexpected strikes shattered the image of British invincibility. They proved that Washington was forcing the most powerful empire on Earth to fight on his terms. Avoiding major battles did not mean avoiding suffering. The winter of 1777 to 1778 brought the Continental Army to its breaking point. At Valley Forge, soldiers faced starvation, freezing temperatures, and rampant disease. Nearly 2,000 men died in these crude log huts, often without proper clothing or even shoes to protect them from the snow. Washington kept the army together through his presence. He chose to live among the troops and share their hardships, rather than seeking comfort elsewhere, earning a level of trust that no formal order could command. Surviving Valley Forge proved the army had the endurance required for Washington's strategy, but to actually win, they needed a transformation. That change came with Baron Friedrich von Steuben. He arrived with a mission to turn the disjointed militia into a professional, disciplined fighting force. Von Steuben used a viral training method. As this network shows, he thoroughly drilled a small, select group of soldiers. Those men then dispersed to teach those exact methods to the rest of the camp, rapidly standardizing the entire army. The British assumed the winter would break the rebellion. Instead, the combination of harsh conditions and new discipline forged a leaner, tougher army, capable of standing toe-to-toe with British professionals. Washington proved that victory does not require overwhelming numbers or territorial dominance. By prioritizing survival over battlefield glory, he demonstrated that against a superior power, the ability to simply stay in the fight is the ultimate victory. In 1776, the American colonies set out to fight the British Empire, taking on the wealthiest, most heavily armed military force on the planet, with almost no professional army of their own. Under the standard rules of 18th century warfare, victory depended on a few specific factors. You marched a large army into an open field, defeated the enemy in direct combat, and then captured their major cities to force a surrender. George Washington initially tried to play by these rules, but during the Battle of Long Island in the summer of 1776, British forces used their superior experience to easily outmaneuver the American lines. Thousands of American soldiers were driven back and trapped in Brooklyn Heights. They faced an advancing British army in front of them and the deep, fast-moving East River cutting off any route of escape from behind. Had the British launched a final assault that morning, the Continental Army would likely be destroyed. George Washington realized that continuing to fight on Britain's conventional terms would lead to the collapse of the entire revolution. That night, under the cover of a heavy fog, Washington organized a silent withdrawal, ferrying his entire army across the river to safety. This narrow escape triggered a total change in his military philosophy. He adopted what historians call a Fabian strategy. He stopped trying to win glorious, decisive battles or hold territory at all costs. Instead, his only objective was keeping the Continental Army alive. As long as the army stayed in the field, the rebellion survived. That brings us to his first rule of survival: weaponize evasion. Washington refused to fight on terms that favored his enemy. If a position was too dangerous to defend, he abandoned it, turning calculated retreats into a core offensive tactic. At a Sunpink Creek, Washington appeared cornered. To fool the British, he left campfires burning all night. Meanwhile, his army secretly hooked around their flank in total darkness, entirely bypassing the main encampment to strike a vulnerable outpost at Princeton. These constant evasions broke the myth of British invincibility. British commanders were left in a state of uncertainty, never knowing where Washington would strike next, or if he intended to fight at all. Washington applied his second rule, striking the weakest link, by turning the crossing of the Delaware into a calculated asymmetric strike. He noticed that British forces were spread out across New Jersey in small, detached outposts. He deliberately bypassed the heavily defended main army to overwhelm a specific target, an overconfident, isolated Hessian garrison stationed in Trenton. Avoiding the enemy could only buy so much time. Rule 3 was to transform the force. To eventually beat a professional military, the Continental Army had to become one. That process began during a grueling winter at Valley Forge. Washington lived among his men, sharing their hardships to build trust through presence. At the same time, Baron von Steuben took the exhausted soldiers and rigorously trained them in standardized, professional battlefield tactics. Valley Forge acted as a crucible. British leadership assumed the harsh conditions would destroy the insurgency. Instead, the spring of 1778 saw a disciplined fighting force march out of those woods, ready to stand toe-to-toe with an empire. The final piece of his strategy, Rule 4, was controlling information. Washington recognized that accurate intelligence could offset a massive deficit in troop numbers, leading to the creation of the Culper spy ring in New York. These operatives were ordinary citizens using sophisticated espionage techniques. They communicated through invisible ink, complex secret ciphers, and hidden dead drops to pass intelligence right under the noses of British guards. Washington cross-referenced this real intelligence while simultaneously feeding false rumors back to the enemy. He forced British commanders to chase shadows, wasting enormous resources defending against attacks that were never coming. By 1781, time had become Washington's primary weapon. Look at this chart showing the compounding financial cost of the conflict for Great Britain. The expense of maintaining an ocean-spanning war eventually crossed a critical threshold of political tolerance in Parliament. This brings us to Yorktown. British General Charles Cornwallis had set up camp on a Virginia peninsula, assuming the Royal Navy would protect or evacuate his troops. Washington saw an opening, but he needed a distraction. He built fake army camps and leaked false reports to convince the main British force in New York that an attack on Manhattan was imminent. While the British braced for an assault on New York, Washington quietly marched his forces south. He timed his arrival with a French naval fleet, which defeated British ships at sea and sealed off the Chesapeake Bay, blocking Cornwallis's only exit. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, Cornwallis was trapped under relentless fire. After weeks of bombardment, he was forced to surrender thousands of soldiers. The British military wasn't destroyed at Yorktown, but losing an entire army proved that the war in America was an unwinnable, endless drain on resources. The staggering cost finally broke Britain's financial ability and political desire to continue the war. Washington's strategy suggests that definitive victory rarely comes from charging headfirst into overwhelming odds. Instead, it comes from the discipline to accept limitations, endure setbacks, and systematically outlast the opponent. In 1775, George Washington took command of a volunteer force of farmers, blacksmiths, and laborers. Across the Atlantic, Great Britain commanded the most formidable fighting force on Earth, backed by a global naval fleet and an industrial economy. For generations, European commanders had followed a predictable logic: find the enemy, march onto an open field, and shatter their lines in a decisive clash. Victory meant capturing territory and forcing a formal surrender. This chart illustrates the mathematical disparity between the two forces. While the British Empire possessed a nearly inexhaustible supply of wealth and reinforcements, the Continental Army relied on a finite, shrinking pool of men and supplies. Attempting to win the war by traditional European standards was a recipe for failure. For Washington, a single catastrophic loss on the battlefield would permanently end the rebellion. The danger of that traditional doctrine became clear in the summer of 1776. British forces successfully outmaneuvered Washington at the Battle of Long Island, driving his army back against the East River. Facing immediate destruction, Washington organized a silent nighttime evacuation. Under the cover of a dense fog, boat after boat ferried his surviving soldiers and cannons across the water to safety. The near miss at Long Island demonstrated that territory was a secondary concern. If the army was destroyed, the revolution ended. If the army survived, the war continued. From that point on, preservation became Washington's strategic priority. To keep his army intact, Washington adopted the Fabian strategy. This ancient doctrine focused on avoiding decisive battles in favor of wearing down a stronger opponent through patience and withdrawals. Washington implemented this by abandoning undefendable positions without hesitation. He faced heavy political criticism for these retreats, with some critics labeling his refusal to stand and fight as a sign of weakness. His logic was simple: An army that survives a tactical defeat can fight again. An army that is destroyed can never recover. Choosing to run rather than fight for pride required extraordinary discipline. Every retreat was a calculated effort to keep the rebellion's heartbeat alive. When Washington did choose to engage, he refused to strike the main British force. Instead, he looked for isolated, vulnerable outposts to secure a win on his own terms. On Christmas night in 1776, he pushed his men across the frozen Delaware River. He marched through a winter storm to launch a surprise attack on an overconfident Hessian garrison at Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 soldiers with almost no American losses. Days later at Princeton, he ordered campfires left burning to trick the British into thinking his army was still in camp. While the enemy watched the flames, Washington's main force slipped away in the dark to strike another British unit nearby. These surgical strikes kept British commanders in a state of constant uncertainty. They could no longer predict where Washington would strike next, or if he intended to fight at all. Every movement was a calculation. Washington only committed his forces when a battle offered a significant psychological impact for a minimal strategic risk. During the winter at Valley Forge, survival was the primary objective. Amidst the snow and log cabins of a starving camp, Baron von Steuben systematically trained the men, turning them into a disciplined, professional fighting force. Simultaneously, Washington established a network of merchants, farmers, and sailors inside British-occupied New York. This became the Culper Spy Ring, a professional intelligence operation designed to monitor enemy movements from the inside. Operating under the threat of execution, these spies relied on sophisticated tradecraft. They used dead drops, invisible ink, and numerical codes to ensure their reports reached Washington without being compromised. Washington weaponized these reports by leaking fabricated troop movements back through the same channels. By feeding the British false intel, he effectively paralyzed their decision-making process. Confusing the enemy with misinformation became just as destructive as engaging them on the battlefield. The revolution was now being fought with secrets as much as muskets. In 1781, Washington's use of deception created a massive strategic opening. He convinced British commanders he was preparing an assault on New York City, forcing them to keep their main army pinned in the north. While the British prepared for a battle that wasn't coming, 17,000 American and French troops began a synchronized march south to trap General Cornwallis in Virginia. The success of the trap depended on the French Navy. By winning the Battle of the Chesapeake, French warships formed a wall severing Cornwallis's sea escape. Completely isolated, Allied artillery pounded British defenses, eventually forcing the surrender of 7,000 soldiers. The success at Yorktown relied on the preceding years of disciplined deception. British intelligence had been so thoroughly blinded that they were unable to react until the trap was already closed. The surrender at Yorktown did not eliminate the global military power of Great Britain, but it did eliminate the political will to continue. Washington had dragged the conflict out so long that the British Parliament no longer believed the war was worth the mounting cost in lives and resources. By prioritizing survival over decisive victory, Washington forced the British Empire to exhaust its resources on an unwinnable war. He willed a new nation into existence by ensuring his army was still standing when the enemy finally decided to give up.